The mighty host was tense as a coiled spring. A great human spring, coiled for the moment when its energy should be released and it would vault the English Channel in the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted. The historic decision to start planning for an invasion of Northern Europe, probably to take place in about May of 1944, had been taken by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. It would be one of the biggest, most ambitious and most daring operations of the war. Following the conference, it was agreed to establish a planning unit to report to the combined British and American Chiefs of Staff. The British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, argued that no field commander could be appointed this far ahead, but that a Chief of Staff could begin planning. And the search for the man with the right qualities began almost as soon as the Chiefs of Staff returned from Casablanca. Major General Sir Frederick Morgan was one of those senior British commanders who in early 1943 was temporarily out of a job. Morgan had fought in the First World War and had survived 4 years as a staff officer on the Western Front. He'd remained in the army in the 20s and 30s, serving for many years in India. He'd fought at Dunkirk in 1940, and then had commanded a division preparing to defend the southwest of England, Devon and Cornwall, had there been a German invasion. In 1942, he'd led an army corps in preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of northwest Africa. Not only was Morgan bright, witty, willing to consider ideas that were new and unorthodox, but his experience in planning Operation Torch had taught him how vital were details like the slope of landing beaches, the range of the tides, and also, crucially, he got on well with the American generals planning the amphibious assault on northwest Africa. The Chiefs of Staff recommended that Morgan should head up this new planning unit for the invasion of Northern Europe. But Churchill wanted to meet him first. He was invited to lunch at Chequers, and clearly it went well. Morgan was offered the job that was given the somewhat cumbersome title of Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander Designate, better abbreviated as COSSAC, Cossack. There was no Supreme Allied Commander at this point and wouldn't be for many months to come, but Morgan could start planning as Chief of Staff to whoever would eventually be appointed. And he would need to draw on all the skills he'd picked up in a lifetime's career in the army for this new task. Initially, everything was on a very small scale. Morgan only had a staff of 4, one of whom was his driver. But in March 1943, the planning went up a gear when American General Ray W. Barker was appointed to head up the US side of what would be, of course, a combined Allied operation. Barker and Morgan got on well, and soon their staff were filling a large building in Norfolk House in London's fashionable West End. The challenges ahead were enormous. The landings in Europe would prove to be the biggest amphibious operation ever mounted. They would require vast supplies of men and all the materiel of war, including everything needed to feed a growing army and care for the wounded. But firstly, there were 3 leading military questions of when, where, and how to launch an invasion. The when question had largely been decided at Casablanca. The invasion was to be launched in the spring, probably May, of 1944. Where was a massive question. The field was as wide as from the Norwegian coast, the coasts of Denmark, Holland, the Pas-de-Calais, and the entire French coast westwards, including Normandy, Brittany, down the coastline along the Bay of Biscay from Bordeaux to the Pyrenees. There had been a disaster at Dieppe in the previous August when an ill-planned Anglo-Canadian operation had gone disastrously wrong. 2/3 of those who landed had been killed, wounded or captured. The fiasco had left the planners thinking it was going to be impossible to seize a well-defended major port. An appeal went out for people to send in personal photographs, picture postcards or other memorabilia, about the beaches from Bergen in Norway to Bordeaux in southwest France. Thousands of pictures poured in, and from these the planners were able to assess the slope of the beaches, the scale of the promenade, and the existence of seaside buildings, shops, cafes, hotels, and villas along the coast. Added to this, a group of experienced photo interpreters from the RAF began to study an abundance of aerial photographs that were being taken by reconnaissance aircraft. In addition to studying beach defences and the construction of German fortifications along the coast, the photo interpreters were able to assess the ability of the shoreline to support armoured vehicles and supply trucks. It was the beginning of a huge operation to survey from the air hundreds of miles of coastline. The question of how was even bigger and more challenging. The initial concept was to get something like 30 divisions or 450,000 men ashore over a period of several days. With them would be needed all the materials required to keep an army on the move: ammunition, vehicles, fuel, food, medical supplies, and so on.
Vast preparations were being made. Huge quantities of materiel and supplies collected. Guns, half-tracks, bombs, ambulances. Yes, ambulances.
Much of this had to be transported across the channel in landing craft of one sort or another, not the most seaworthy of vessels, in sometimes stormy seas. The naval support required to protect the invasion from enemy attacks, whether on or below the surface of water, had to be considerable. And the air cover necessary to weaken the defences in advance of the landings and then to cover the beaches and the beachhead as the troops made their way inland was enormous. Would the resources needed for such a combined operation ever be available? The scale of the problems facing Morgan and his growing team of planners were immense. Several areas could be ruled out quickly as potential landing zones. The Norwegian coast, with its mass of fjords, would be impossibly hard on which to land troops. Likewise, the Danish and Dutch coasts, behind which were areas of great sand dunes, would make it difficult to move troops off the beach to advance inland. The Belgian coast offered relatively few good landing opportunities, as did Brittany, where high cliffs favoured the defenders. The beaches along the Bay of Biscay, although good for possible troop landings, were out of range of the fighter aircraft that would be needed to cover a landing. That left two possible stretches of beach: the Pas de Calais and the Normandy beaches around Caen. The Pas de Calais, the stretch of coast roughly from Dunkirk to Boulogne, had the advantage of offering the shortest crossing route over the Channel and a good starting point for a liberation of occupied France, and a passage into Belgium, Holland, and ultimately into Germany itself. But it was strongly defended from cliffs that overlooked many of the possible landing beaches. Normandy had the disadvantage of being further to get to across a choppy channel, and posed a longer route for an army to advance into the heart of the Third Reich. But its beaches were more suitable on which to land men and machines, and there were gaps in the dunes for an army to progress inland. Additionally, on the Cotentin Peninsula there was the possibility of capturing a port, Cherbourg. The choice seemed to whittle down to that between the Pas de Calais and Normandy. Yet another issue was the availability of landing craft. These ranged from smaller so-called LCIs, landing craft infantry, each one simply to bring a platoon of about 30 men ashore, to large LSTs, landing ships tank, more like cross-channel ferries, to bring armour, vehicle and supplies onto the beaches. The need for landing craft on so many fronts, in Italy, in the Pacific, where the US Marines were hopping from one island to another to evict Japanese forces, meant there was always a demand for more landing craft than were available. In August 1943, at another Anglo-American conference, this time in Quebec, Morgan and Barker presented their findings to the combined chiefs of staff and to Roosevelt and Churchill. Morgan recommended that although a landing in the Pas de Calais offered the shortest crossing across the Channel, its beaches were too heavily defended. The excellent road and rail links provided the enemy with an easy route to bring up reinforcements, and the region offered no natural defences for protecting the beachhead after the landings had been made. So they concluded that Normandy offered the better prospects for a successful landing zone. The combined chiefs approved the choice. The target date for the landings was set as 1st of May 1944. Another crucial step towards the launch of what was now being called Operation Overlord had been taken. The appointment of a general to command Operation Overlord was not made for a few months until December. Roosevelt had hinted to Marshall that he would be put in charge of this very high-profile operation, but in the end, the president chose General Dwight D. Eisenhower to take control, with a position titled Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower had already shown in running Operation Torch and in the campaigns in Sicily and Italy that he was very capable of managing combined operations and that he was an immensely skilled planner and organizer. As an American was rightly put in charge, a British general, Bernard Montgomery, the victor of El Alamein, was put in command of land forces, and a British admiral, Sir Bertram Ramsay, was made naval commander. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Ramsay, and the other senior commanders all took up their posts in late December 1943 or the very beginning of 1944. Key strategic decisions had already been made, but now detailed planning rapidly went up into the fast gear. There would be 5 beaches, on 2 of which American troops would land. British, Canadian, and other troops, including French and Poles, would land on the remaining 3. Airborne assaults would be carried out the night before to seize control of the 2 flanks to prevent the Germans from rushing up reinforcements. By the end of the day, it was hoped that more than 150,000 men would have got ashore. In the following days, hundreds of thousands more would be transported across the Channel to what was hoped would be a growing beachhead. Everything about the final plans for D-Day was on a gargantuan scale. The date for what everyone now referred to as D-Day was slowly put back, firstly to late May and then to early June, to allow for final preparations. By the spring of 1944, much of southwestern England had become a vast military camp. The government had established zones across the south where no civilian was allowed to enter. Hundreds of thousands of men gathered in their assembly areas. At the beginning of June, they were completely cut off from the outside world and were forbidden from leaving their encampments. One after another, commanders were briefed, and then intelligence officers passed on the final briefings to their men. For the first time, they were told exactly where they were going to land. Many were surprised to hear it was in Normandy and not the Pas de Calais, the southwest of France, or the Dutch coast. But most were relieved to hear that the beaches were flat and there were no high cliffs to scale. All units were shown aerial photos of the section of the beach they were to land on. Hundreds of models had been made of some of the beaches so the men could study them and get a sense of the terrain they would encounter after landing. Most men were impressed by the details they were given and felt confident that their commanders had things under control and knew what they were doing. Some of the men were given small amounts of French currency, French phrase books, and extra rations to cover the 24 hours after landing. A few of the Americans were given condoms. It wasn't clear if they were for covering the barrel of their rifles to keep them dry in water or for other purposes. Once the men had received their orders with details of what their mission would be, they were sealed in and told they couldn't leave camp. Military police guarded every encampment. Often extra rations were made available, and quartermasters supplied extra beer. "I'm being fattened up for the slaughter, and am simply waiting for it to start," wrote the poet Keith Douglas in one of these camps. Huge, elongated parks of tanks, of vehicles, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and every other type of supply that would be needed were piled high behind barbed wire in camps. Again, they were closely guarded and cut off from prying eyes. Every soldier, every weapon, every tank, every vehicle was entered on a vast schedule and told to arrive at their embarkation point at exactly the right time to be loaded onto vessels in exactly the right order for their disembarkation on the other side of the channel. It was a huge and immensely complex logistics operation. Everything was set. D-Day was scheduled for Monday, the 5th of June. The first ships would sail 48 hours beforehand from the ports along the south coast and all the way round to Bristol. Eisenhower later wrote that the mighty host was tense as a coiled spring, a great human spring, coiled for the moment when its energy should be released and it would vault the English Channel in the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted. Everything and everyone seemed ready. At the end of May, southern England was enjoying a hot spell. High pressure prevailed. It was warm, dry, and there was little wind. Ideal invasion weather. All the men ready for D-Day were waiting for the signal to go.